Are you really going to ask for her opinion? She has no idea what's going on anymore. Just nod and do it your way, as always. The words from Eva, my daughter-in-law, weren't loud, but thin and sharp, like a surgical scalpel slicing through the silence of the hallway. I froze by the door to my room, the heavy folder with the dacha's documents suddenly weightless in my hands, the air in my lungs turning to ice. It was Thursday, 11 in the morning. My son, Alan, and his wife had come to discuss our shared future, which in their pragmatic dialect meant selling the property. I heard Alan's quiet reply, a soft, spineless agreement, and that sound, the sound of his betrayal, hit harder than her words. They had declared me incompetent, delivering a verdict in the cozy hallway of my own home, unaware that the jury, judge, and executioner stood in one person just a meter away. I gave no sign. I didn't cough, didn't drop the folder. Instead, I slowly, almost soundlessly closed the door, turned the key in the lock, and walked to the old mirror. The face looking back at me belonged to an 80-year-old woman. A lace of wrinkles, the ash of gray hair, but the eyes were as clear as they had been 50 years ago. It was the gaze of a history teacher who had just watched her best student burn his textbooks. I felt my mind, my greatest asset, being turned into a symptom of an illness in a matter of seconds. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and left the room. When I entered the living room with a tray holding 3 porcelain cups and a lemon cake, they fell silent. Eva stretched a smile across her face that didn't touch her cold eyes. Alan rose hastily. "Mom, you shouldn't have bothered," he said. "Nonsense," my voice was even calm as always. Tea is a tradition for conversation. I poured them their drinks, inhaling the scent of bergamot, which suddenly smelled to me like the stench of lies. They talked about the grandchildren, the weather, about real estate prices that had risen so favorably. I nodded, smiled, and kept the conversation going, but I didn't hear them. I heard only a ringing in my ears and the quiet ticking of my grandfather's clock, measuring out the minutes until the end of this farce. I was the strategist in the shadows, and they were bad actors on my stage, oblivious that the director had already changed the play's ending. When the front door closed behind them, the silence brought no relief. It became heavy, like a tombstone. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the 2 half-empty cups on the table. Their presence desecrated the space. Without thinking, I took them both, carried them to the kitchen, and methodically, one by one, smashed them in the trash bin. The sharp crack of porcelain became the first note of my new score. Then I took out my favorite, old cup, brewed a strong black tea just as my late husband, Richard, had liked it, and sat down at his desk in the study, the desk where strategies were born. Here, surrounded by books on economics and history, the past descended, not like a fog, but like a clear, detailed report. The year 2010, this very study. Alan, then still full of youthful fire, was waving his arms, talking about his dream, a consulting firm. "Mom, Dad, this is my chance. I feel it. This is going to fly," he'd said. Richard, my prudent Richard, had frowned. "Alan, feelings aren't a business plan. Where are the numbers? The market analysis?" I had silently placed a thick folder in front of them, one I had worked on for 3 months. "Enthusiasm is the fuel, Alan, not the engine," I said calmly then. "Here is the engine." It had everything: competitor analysis, profitability forecasts, asset diversification, the break-even point at the 24-month mark. Richard spent a long time turning the pages, his skepticism melting with every chart. "Beatrice, $100,000. That's almost all of our savings," he said quietly, looking at me, not at our son. It's not an expense, Richard. It's an investment, I replied, meeting his gaze. I've calculated the risks. This is the safest investment possible, an investment in our child. Alan had hugged me then, his eyes shining with gratitude. Mom, I'll never forget this. Never. He forgot. Or worse, he decided the memory statute of limitations had expired. Another memory surfaced, warmer and more painful. The same dacha they now want to sell. I see Richard's hands hammering together the boards for the veranda. I am 35, Alan is 10. We're lying in the grass as I point out the constellations, telling him stories of the ancient Greeks who saw heroes in those stars. He looked at me with such fascination, as if I had created the heavens myself. To them, that dacha is just an asset, a line item on a financial statement. To me, it is the archive of my life, the place where I taught my son not just to see, but to understand. They don't just want to sell the land. They want to annul my memories, to declare them illiquid. They thought my memory was fading, I whispered into the silence of the study. They forgot that I remember every dollar and every star I invested in them. My internal monologue was cold and merciless. Just nod and do it your way, as always. The worst part was the as always. It meant they had been playing this game for a long time, and I was the only one who didn't know the rules. It meant every caring phone call, every "How are you, Mom?" was part of the performance. My son, my student, had revealed himself to be the lazy pupil who decided it was easier to declare the teacher insane than to sit for the exam. The disappointment was far stronger than the offense. It was pure, distilled, like poison. They didn't just want my money or my dacha, they wanted the right to think for me. That is the ultimate theft of self. The self-pity lasted exactly as long as it took for the tea in my cup to cool. I drained it, set the cup down on the desk with a definitive click, and began to act. My mind, which they had so graciously written off, began to operate with a cold-blooded logic that would terrify them. First, the evidence. I walked to the old safe, hidden behind a landscape painting. Click, 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 the combination only I knew. Inside, in a leather portfolio, lay my life, translated into the language of documents. The deed to the house, Richard's will leaving everything unconditionally to me, and, most importantly, the very folder with Alan's business plan and the bank statement showing the transfer of $100,000 from our joint account to his new one. I laid them out on the desk. This was my arsenal. Next, the external consultation. I found a business card in my address book, given to me long ago by a friend. Davidson and Partners, elder law specialists. My finger was steady as I dialed the number. Good afternoon. My name is Beatrice Wolski. I require an urgent consultation regarding the procedure for confirming cognitive capacity and the legal aspects of challenging a potential guardianship. The voice on the other end was professional and respectful. Not a hint of condescension. We scheduled a meeting for tomorrow. After hanging up, I felt the first clean breath of air I had taken all day. This was the beginning. Finally, the symbolic ritual. I took my daily planner from the desk, where I noted important dates. I found the page with Alan's birthday. For a few seconds, I stared at his name, written in my calligraphic script. Then I picked up a pen with black ink and neatly, with 2 straight lines, crossed it out. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an editorial correction, the deletion of a character who no longer fit the plot. I closed the planner. The study was silent. But now, it wasn't the oppressive silence of loneliness, but the silence of a chess game before a decisive move. That night, I understood that I hadn't lost my family. I had simply said goodbye to the version of my family that existed only in my memory. He thought I was an old book that could be put on a shelf. He didn't expect that I could write a new, entirely different ending. And I will. The offices of Davidson and Partners were an oasis of mahogany and quiet competence. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint, reassuring scent of brewed coffee. It was a world away from the emotional storm of the day before. I sat opposite Mr. Davidson, a man whose placid face and sharp eyes suggested he had witnessed every form of human folly and was surprised by none of it. There was no tremor in my hands, no quaver in my voice. My heart wasn't pounding. It was beating with the steady, rhythmic purpose of a grandfather clock. This was not a plea, it was an instruction. Mr. Davidson, I began, my voice clear in the soundproofed room. I wish to begin the process of a complete overhaul of my legal and financial affairs. The first order of business is to revoke the durable power of attorney currently held by my son, Alan Wolski. Immediately. He didn't flinch, simply made a note on a crisp yellow legal pad. And the second order of business, I continued, is to draft a new last will and testament. The current one is obsolete. He looked up, his gaze analytical, not pitiful. Understood, Mrs. Wolski. May I ask what has prompted this decisive course of action? I met his eyes. A clarification, I said. I have recently come to understand that my estate requires a more professional, less sentimental form of management. Control, Mr. Davidson, is not about power. It's about self-preservation. I am merely repairing my foundations before the structure collapses. He nodded slowly, a flicker of profound respect in his eyes. He saw not a frail old woman, but a CEO retaking her company. The following days unfolded not with the chaos of revenge, but with the methodical precision of a repair checklist. It was a project plan for the reclamation of my life. My first arena was legal repair. With Mr. Davidson, I systematically dismantled the framework that gave my son any claim to my life. We drafted a new power of attorney, naming a licensed financial fiduciary from a respected firm as my agent. They will be obligated by law to act in your best interest, and only your best interest, he explained. They trade in trust, not affection. Then came the will. We established a charitable trust, the Richard and Beatrice Wolski Foundation for Historical Education, which would become the sole beneficiary of my estate upon my death. My son's name was not mentioned. It wasn't an omission, it was an erasure. Next came the financial repair. I walked into the main branch of my bank, the same one where years ago I had authorized the $100,000 transfer that had launched Alan's career. The marble floors felt cold and solid beneath my feet. I sat with the bank manager, a woman named Miss Albright, and calmly laid out my requests. I need to remove Alan Wolski's name as a secondary user from all my accounts, effective immediately. As she typed, her fingers flying across the keyboard, a memory ambushed me, a flash of a small, chubby hand gripping a crayon as I guided a 5-year-old Alan in writing his name for the first time, A-L-A-N, his triumphant smile. The memory didn't bring tears. It brought a chilling clarity. The boy I taught to sign his name was not the man whose signature I was now revoking. Also, I said, my voice unwavering, I would like to liquidate the joint investment portfolio and transfer the capital into a new one under my sole proprietorship. And please issue new passwords for all online access. I was no longer the family matriarch. I was the owner of my assets, securing the perimeter. The third front was physical repair. A locksmith, a young man with kind eyes and capable hands, arrived on Saturday morning. He worked efficiently, replacing the locks on every door. The sound of the drill, the scrape of metal, the final, satisfying click of the new bolt sliding into place, it was the sound of my fortress being secured. "This one's a high-security Medico lock, ma'am," he said, handing me a set of uniquely shaped keys. Can't be picked, can't be bumped. No one's getting in without one of these. I took the keys. They felt heavy and real in my palm. I was no longer just a resident. I was the protector of my domain. Throughout this process, they tried to breach my new walls. Their presence was reduced to pathetic, disembodied pleas from the answering machine. I would return from an appointment and see the blinking red light a frantic digital heartbeat. One evening, I stood and listened to a message from Alan, his voice laced with that familiar theatrical concern. "Mom? Mom? Are you there? I've been calling all day. Eva and I are worried sick. Is everything okay? Please, just call me back so I know you're safe." A pause. And then I heard Eva's sharp whisper in the background, not quite muffled. "Did she pick up?" I pressed the delete button. My internal commentary was cold and precise. They weren't worried. They were alarmed. A resource had gone offline, and they were experiencing a service disruption. Between these procedural strikes, I found solace in breathing scenes. I spent an afternoon in my garden, my hands deep in the soil, methodically pulling weeds. Each weed was a silent resentment, a long-held disappointment, now uprooted and tossed aside. As I pruned the dead branches from my rose bushes, I felt a kinship with them. I was cutting away what was sick to allow new, healthy growth. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, leaned over the fence. "Your roses are looking magnificent this year, Beatrice," she exclaimed. "They just needed some attention," I replied, smiling. It was the first genuine smile in a week. I was not isolating myself from the world, only from the part of it that sought to poison me. The symbolic repairs were the final, quietest steps. I took the box of old family photos from the closet. I didn't burn them. That would have been an act of passion, and this was an act of logic. I separated them, placing photos of Alan as a child, of family holidays, of all the curated happiness into a sturdy archival box. Using a black marker, I wrote on the side, "Historical Archive, 1978 to 2024. It was the act of a historian closing a chapter, not a mother disowning a son. I then took the tattered copy of the business plan I had written for him, the one I had found in the safe. I didn't rip it. I calmly fed it, page by page, into the paper shredder. The whirring sound was deeply satisfying, turning his engine into meaningless confetti. Finally, I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and searched for the local library's chess club schedule. I noted the time for their Tuesday evening tournament. It was a plan that belonged only to me. That evening, for the first time in years, I drove downtown with no purpose other than my own pleasure. I walked into an old, elegant bookstore that Richard and I used to frequent, a place that smelled of paper and possibility. I ran my fingers over the spines of books on Roman history and economic theory. I selected a heavy, hardcover volume on the strategic campaigns of Belisarius. At the counter, as the cashier wrapped it in brown paper, I felt a profound sense of peace. It was a small purchase. A quiet declaration. In that moment, I was choosing myself. The insistent knocking on the new oak door was not frantic, but rhythmic and entitled, as if the door simply hadn't understood its purpose yet. It was Tuesday morning. I was in the sunroom, sipping tea and reading the book on Belisarius I'd bought myself. Outside, I could see Alan's silhouette through the frosted glass. He knocked again, then pressed the new doorbell. A polite, melodic chime filled the house, a sound utterly devoid of urgency. He called my name, his voice muffled. "Mom? Are you in there? The key isn't working." I took another sip of tea, the warmth of the porcelain a comforting anchor in my hands. I turned a page. He wasn't yelling, not yet. He was confused, like a programmer whose once flawless code was suddenly returning an error. His entire life, this door had always opened for him. His access had been unconditional. He could not conceive of a world where it wouldn't. I heard him sigh in frustration, the sound carrying faintly through the wood. Then, the buzz of his phone against the door as he tried to call me. My own phone, resting on the table beside me, remained dark and silent. His number was blocked. He was locked out not by steel and brass, but by a decision. My internal monologue was quiet, recalling a phrase my own mother used to say. If they do not hear you when you speak softly, they will hear your silence much louder. He eventually gave up. The sound of his car pulling away from the curb was the sound of a chapter closing. After he was gone, I began my inventory. This house was no longer just a home. It was a museum of a life I was preparing to leave behind. I walked slowly, deliberately, through the rooms, conducting a final audit of my memories. My first stop was the old wingback chair in the living room, its fabric worn smooth over decades. My fingers traced the faded floral pattern. A warm memory surfaced. Alan, aged 7, curled up in this chair, sick with the flu, as I read Treasure Island to him, his small head resting on my lap. The scent of old books and his feverish warmth filled my senses. Then, a cold memory pushed it aside. The same chair, just last Christmas. Alan, scrolling through his phone, barely looking up as I tried to tell him about a documentary I'd watched. "That's nice, Mom," he'd said, his voice flat with disinterest, the blue light of the screen illuminating his vacant expression. The chair held both the boy who craved my stories and the man who dismissed them. I moved on to his childhood bedroom, which I had kept largely unchanged. The walls were still a pale blue, the color of a summer sky. On the shelf sat a row of meticulously built model airplanes. I remembered the intense concentration on his face as he glued the tiny pieces together, his tongue sticking out in effort. He had the patience for detail then. He was a builder. A cold memory followed. Eva, standing in this doorway a few months ago during a visit. "You know, B," she'd said with a dismissive wave of her hand, "we could turn this into a great home office. All this clutter just collects dust." She didn't see a shrine to a beloved childhood. She saw unused square footage. She saw an asset not performing to its full potential. My final stop was the kitchen table, the heart of our family. I ran my hand over the dark, scarred wood. So many warm memories lived here. The smell of birthday cakes, the boisterous laughter of holiday dinners, the quiet mornings with Richard, our hands clasped over mugs of coffee. But it was also the site of the most recent, most painful wound. I could still see Alan and Eva sitting here, their faces earnest and patronizing, as they'd proposed selling the dacha. "It's just too much for you to handle, Mom," Alan had said, his tone dripping with false concern. They had used this table, a symbol of our unity, as the stage for their first strategic move to dismantle my independence. It was here they began the narrative of my decline. The walk was not sorrowful. It was clarifying. I returned to the study, took out a fresh sheet of paper from Richard's desk, and drew a line down the middle. On one side, I wrote, "to keep." On the other, "to leave behind." The first list was surprisingly short. The second was not about objects, but about burdens, expectations, disappointments. The ghost of the son he used to be. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it in my pocket. The inventory was complete. It was time to pack. My packing was not a hurried escape, but a deliberate, meditative ritual. I wasn't just packing boxes. I was curating the artifacts of my future. I bypassed the furniture, the dishes, the sprawling collections of a long life. Instead, I went to the closet and pulled out a heavy, dust-covered wooden box. Inside, nestled in velvet, was the old, worn chess set Richard had given me on our 5th anniversary. The ivory pieces were yellowed with age, the ebony ones smooth and cool to the touch. This was not just a game. It was a symbol of my intellect, my strategic mind, the very essence of me that they had tried to declare null and void. I took each piece out, wiping it gently with a soft cloth. The king, the queen, the clever knights. I wrapped each one individually in silk paper and placed it back in its slot. This was the one thing I was taking that was purely for myself. Next, I packed the book on Belisarius and my favorite porcelain teacup, the one I had not smashed. These items went into a small, sturdy box lined with soft fabric. I sealed it carefully with packing tape, smoothing down the edges. Then I took a thick black marker and wrote on the top of the box in clear, firm letters. The label was not a destination, but a declaration of purpose. It did not say kitchen or living room. It said simply, future. When the last box was sealed, I looked around the room. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house no longer felt empty, it felt clean. Ready for new stories. Stories that would be written without me. The days after the final box was packed were filled with a quiet, exhilarating momentum. I was a general who had successfully secured my territory and was now planning the next campaign, the campaign for my own future. On Wednesday, I made the call. "Good morning," I said to the leasing agent, my voice steady. "I'm calling about the one-bedroom apartment on Sycamore Street. The one with the balcony overlooking the park." "Yes, I'd like to schedule a viewing." The next day, I sat on my porch, a place where I used to sit waiting for my family to visit, and felt a profound shift. I was no longer waiting. I was simply being. I watched the birds, felt the warmth of the sun on my face, and experienced a freedom so complete it was almost dizzying. My thoughts drifted to Alan, but without the familiar ache of betrayal. The image of the son I had raised, the curious boy, the ambitious young man, had finally separated from the man he had become. I mourned the loss of that idea, the boy in my memory, but I no longer mourned the man who had driven away from my locked door. The turning point came on Friday afternoon. An unknown number flashed on my phone's screen. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but some instinct prompted me to answer. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, fragile. "Grandma? It's Leo, my grandson, Alan and Eva's 19-year-old son." He was a quiet, observant boy, often lost in the shadow of his parents' assertive personalities. I hadn't expected the call to come from him. "Leo?" I said, my tone calm but neutral. There was a long pause filled with the static of his uncertainty. "Grandma, I just wanted to say I'm sorry." The words were barely a whisper. Here was the test. The old me, the matriarch, would have rushed in to soothe him, to absolve him instantly. "Oh, it's all right, dear. It's not your fault." But the new me, the strategist, held her ground. My silence was not cold, but expectant. I needed to know if this was genuine remorse or just a new tactic. "For what exactly are you sorry, Leo?" I asked softly. The question wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation to clarity. He stumbled over his words. For everything. For not saying anything when Dad and Mom talked about you. For being there in the car when they were angry you weren't answering. I just sat there. I went along with it. I'm sorry." His voice cracked on the last words. He wasn't just repeating a line his parents fed him. He was articulating his own failure, his own complicity. He was taking ownership. "Thank you for that, Leo," I said, and the words were sincere. "That means a great deal." A silence followed, this one less tense. "I'd like to see you, Grandma," he finally said. "If that's okay." I considered it. The fortress I had built was strong, but a fortress with no gate is a prison. "All right, Leo, I said, "but on my terms. You come here tomorrow at 2, and you come alone." He arrived precisely at 2 o'clock the next day. The rain had started, a gentle, cleansing drizzle that washed the dust from the air. When I opened the door, he stood on the porch looking smaller than I remembered, his shoulders slumped. I didn't rush to hug him. I simply stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. I had baked a simple shortbread, its buttery scent filling the quiet house. We sat at the kitchen table, the site of so many old wounds, and I poured us both tea. The atmosphere was restrained, a little awkward, but not hostile. He struggled to explain himself. "I don't know why I didn't speak up," he mumbled, staring into his cup. "It was just easier not to. Dad gets so certain about things. And Mom, she just agrees with him. I guess I was just copying their behavior." I listened without judgment, letting his confession fill the space between us. When he finished, I didn't offer platitudes. I offered an observation. "You weren't just copying them, Leo," I said gently. "You wanted to belong. It's a powerful human need to be part of the tribe. Sometimes the price of belonging is silence." He looked up, his eyes wide with the dawning understanding. He wasn't just a coward. He was a young man caught in a dysfunctional system, and I had just given him the language to understand it. We talked for another hour, not about the past, but about his future, his college courses, his hopes. It was the first honest conversation we'd had in years. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Grandma, can I come back? Can we do this again?" This was the moment of the new contract. "Yes, Leo," I said, meeting his hopeful gaze. "You are always welcome here, but not for my baking or for birthday checks, or out of a sense of obligation. You come only when you want to have a real conversation, when you are willing to tell the truth and to hear it." He nodded, a slow, solemn agreement. I went to the counter, wrapped a few pieces of shortbread in a napkin, and handed them to him. It wasn't a peace offering to the old regime. It was the first provision for a new, healthier alliance. After he left, I stood by the window and watched the rain fall. The walls of my fortress had been breached, not by an enemy army, but by a single, remorseful diplomat. The breach was not a weakness, it was an evolution. Perhaps, I thought, some doors should not be bolted and barred forever. Perhaps they only need to be locked gently from the inside, leaving a window slightly ajar for the ones who learn to approach alone and to knock softly. The day I signed the lease was crisp and clear, the autumn air holding a promise of cleansing cold to come. I dressed for the appointment with the precision of a diplomat attending a treaty signing, not in my usual soft cardigans, but in a tailored wool blazer, charcoal gray, and a simple silk blouse the color of ivory. My silver hair was neatly pinned up, and I wore the pearl earrings Richard had given me for our 40th anniversary, a quiet armor of elegance and memory. The real estate office was modern and minimalist, all glass and chrome, smelling faintly of citrus air freshener and ambition. It was a world away from the dusty scent of my old life. The apartment itself was a revelation. It was on the 7th floor of a well-maintained building, and the first thing that struck me was the light. It poured in through a large balcony door, illuminating the clean white walls and polished hardwood floors. The air smelled of fresh paint and possibility. From the balcony, I could see the sprawling green expanse of the city park, the trees a riot of gold and crimson. The sounds were different here, not the suburban quiet punctuated by lawnmowers, but the distant, rhythmic hum of a living city. It was the sound of forward motion. The agent, a polished young woman, pointed out the modern appliances and ample closet space. But I wasn't looking at those. I was looking at the view, at the endless sky. I had spent a lifetime looking inward, managing the enclosed world of my family. Now my gaze was fixed outward. "I'll take it," I said, my decision not just made, but settled, as if it had been waiting for me all along. Back in the office, I signed the documents with a steady hand. The pen, a heavy, expensive fountain pen provided by the agency, felt solid and authoritative. As I wrote my name, Beatrice Wolski, the signature looked different to me, not the signature of a wife or a mother, but that of an individual entering into a contract for her own future. After the papers were signed and the keys were in my hand, I did something I hadn't planned. I walked to a nearby florist and bought a single, perfect white orchid. Carrying it back to my car, I knew it would be the first thing I placed in my new home, a symbol not of what I had lost, but of the resilient, complex beauty I was determined to cultivate. That evening, as I began the methodical process of packing the future box and a few others, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the insistent, entitled ring of Alan's previous visit. It was hesitant, almost apologetic. I knew it was him. Through the peephole, I saw him standing on the porch, his shoulders slumped in the same defeated posture as his son, Leo. He looked older, diminished. I did not open the door. I simply stood on the other side, a silent sentinel. "Mom?" he called out, his voice thin against the thick oak. "Mom, please. I know you're in there. Leo told me he saw you. Can we just talk?" I remained silent. This was not a conversation to be had. It was a verdict to be heard. "I don't understand what's happening," he continued, his voice rising with a note of pathetic frustration. "You've changed the locks. You won't answer your phone. Did we do something wrong?" The sheer, breathtaking ignorance of the question almost made me laugh. Did we do something wrong? It was the question of a child who had smashed a vase and couldn't comprehend the anger it caused. "Yes, Alan," I said, my voice calm and clear, easily passing through the door. "You did." He was taken aback by my response. "What? What are you talking about? Selling the DACA? Mom, we were just trying to help, to make things easier for you." First manipulation, the guise of help. "My mind is not a burden for you to lighten, Alan," I replied, my voice level. "My assets are not a problem for you to solve. You weren't helping me. You were helping yourself." There was a long silence. I could hear his strained breathing. "Eva didn't mean it like that," he tried. A new tactic. "She's just pragmatic. She worries about you." Second manipulation. Blaming his wife. "Her pragmatism has a name, Alan. It's called condescension. And your acquiescence has a name too. It's called betrayal." He finally broke, a choked sob. "I just want my mom back," he whimpered, a final, desperate appeal to emotion. Third manipulation. Invoking the past. "The woman you're looking for, the one who built your business plans and overlooked your disrespect, no longer lives here," I said, the finality in my voice like the closing of a vault. "You will receive a letter from my lawyer in due course. Goodbye, Alan." I heard him stay there for a few more moments, then the sound of his footsteps retreating, the crunch of gravel as he drove away. And then, and only then, did I allow myself to feel. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, and for 7 minutes, I wept. I wept for the boy with the model airplanes. I wept for the love I had poured into a vessel that had proven to have a crack in it all along. And when the 7 minutes were up, I dried my eyes, went to the kitchen, and put the kettle on. The grief was real, but its duration was now under my control. The next afternoon was a balm. I hosted my 2 oldest friends, Eleanor and Margaret, for tea. Eleanor, a retired librarian with a wicked sense of humor, and Margaret, a painter whose hands were perpetually stained with turquoise and ochre. They were my true peers, women who had lived lives as complex and layered as my own. The atmosphere in my living room was warm, filled with the scent of Earl Grey tea and ELEANOR'S lemon poppy seed cake. We didn't speak of family drama. Instead, Margaret told a hilarious story about a disastrous life-drawing class, and Eleanor recounted her latest battle with the self-checkout machine at the grocery store, elevating it to an epic saga of woman versus machine. In their company, I felt seen, understood, and utterly normal. After a while, I set my cup down. "I have some news," I said quietly. "I'm moving." They both looked at me, their expressions open and curious. "I've taken an apartment in the city, overlooking the park." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Oh, Beatrice," she said, her eyes shining. "Good for you." Eleanor raised her teacup. "To new chapters," she toasted, her smile wide and genuine. "And to architects of their own lives." There was no pity, no intrusive questions, only celebration. This was my new family, a family built on mutual respect, not on obligation. Eva arrived 2 days later. She didn't knock. She used the key Alan still had before the locks were changed, inserting it into the old lock, and was met with the unyielding resistance of new metal. The furious, insistent pounding that followed was the sound of a queen discovering she has been deposed. I opened the door. She stood there, impeccably dressed in a sharp business suit, her face a mask of cold fury. She stormed past me into the living room, her eyes darting around, taking in the stacked boxes. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "What do you think you're doing?" "I'm moving," I said calmly, closing the door behind her. "Alan came here, crying," she snapped, whirling to face me. "You've broken his heart. After everything we've done for you." "Let's be precise, Ava," I replied, my voice dangerously soft. "You have not done things for me. You have made calculations about me, and your calculations were found to be in error." She scoffed. "This is about the dacha, isn't it? About a silly comment I made?" "My God, Beatrice, you're a 72-year-old woman acting like a petulant child." First, manipulation, trivializing my feelings. "I am an 80-year-old woman, Eva. Precision is important," I corrected her gently. "And this is not about a comment. It is about a pattern. It is about the assumption that my mind, the very mind that designed the blueprint for your husband's success, had become a liability." "We are your family," she insisted, her voice rising. "We were looking out for you. You need us." Second, manipulation. The appeal to familial duty. "You were looking out for your interests," I countered. "They believe that my memory is fading. They forgot that I remember every dollar I invested in them. Family is not a shield you can hide behind when you are caught stealing someone's autonomy." Her face hardened. "You'll be all alone," she hissed, her final, cruelest weapon. "You'll die alone in some sterile apartment, and no one will even notice." Third, manipulation. The prophecy of lonely doom. I let the silence hang for a moment before I delivered the final blow. I smiled, a small, sad, but utterly unshakable smile. I would rather drink tea alone in my own sovereign state than be a tolerated guest in a colony that I, myself, founded and funded. Then I walked to my desk, picked up a single, crisp document, and handed it to her. It was a copy of the audit I had conducted on Alan's business, the one where I had found the $30,000 in financial miscalculations. Her eyes scanned the first page, the color draining from her face. She saw the charts, the highlighted figures, the the cool, analytical breakdown of their incompetence. She saw my intellect, not as a fading relic, but as a weapon pointed directly at the heart of their security. He thought I was an old book to be put on a shelf, I said softly. He didn't expect I could still write a new ending. She stared at the papers, then at me, her mask of fury finally crumbling to reveal the raw panic beneath. She was defeated. Without another word, she turned and walked out. Her posture was no longer that of a conqueror, but of a retreating soldier. The door closed behind her with a quiet click. I did not feel triumph, nor did I feel sorrow. I felt only a profound, echoing silence. But this time, it was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of sovereignty. The final threads of my old life were snipped not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet professionalism of a legal proceeding. A week after Eva's visit, I received a call from Mr. Davidson. His voice was as calm and steady as ever, a welcome contrast to the emotional turbulence of the preceding weeks. "Good morning, Mrs. Wolski," he said. "I'm calling to confirm that the final transfer of assets is complete. The trust is fully funded, and the updated will has been officially filed with the probate court. From this moment on, you are the sole arbiter of every inch of your life." The phrase hung in the air, sole arbiter. It was more than a legal term. It was a declaration of independence. There were no longer any ambiguous ownerships, no shared access points, no back doors left open for sentiment or manipulation to creep through. The fortress was not just secure, its sovereignty was now legally recognized by the state. My last practical step was small but deeply significant. I drove to the local post office and officially closed the family P.O. box we'd had for over 30 years, the one where birthday cards, holiday letters, and bank statements had all mingled in a shared narrative. I handed the 2 keys back to the clerk. "Just closing this one out," I said simply. He nodded, processed the request, and handed me a receipt. As I walked out into the bright afternoon, I felt a lightness, as if I had just set down a heavy bag I hadn't realized I was carrying. The flow of information, the last shared artery, was now severed. Every piece of mail, every official document, would now come directly to me, and me alone. Leo called the next day, his voice still hesitant but with a new undercurrent of warmth. "Grandma, I was wondering, could I come over? To the old house, I mean. One last time?" So I agreed. When he arrived, the atmosphere was entirely different from his last visit. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared understanding. We didn't sit formally at the kitchen table. Instead, we sat on the floor of the nearly empty living room, surrounded by sealed boxes, and ate simple shortbread cookies from a tin. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to be peacefully saying their goodbyes to the room. We worked on a crossword puzzle together, a comfortable silence punctuated by clues and quiet laughter. "Dad says you've disowned him," Leo said softly, not looking at me, but at the puzzle. "He said you've become hard, cold." I considered his words before answering, choosing them with care. "Your father is mourning a version of me that was convenient for him, Leo," I explained. "He's not mourning me. He's mourning his unpaid strategist, his unconditional banker, his emotional caretaker. I haven't become hard. I've just become whole. There's a difference." He seemed to understand. After a while, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, framed object. It was a charcoal sketch. He had drawn a single chess piece, a queen, standing alone in the center of the board, powerful and serene. It wasn't a perfect drawing, the lines were a bit shaky, but it was rendered with an incredible amount of care. "I made this for you," he said, "for your new place, because, well, you're the Queen. My eyes welled up. This wasn't a gift of obligation. It was a gift of recognition. He saw me not as a frail grandmother, but as the most powerful piece on the board. "Thank you, Leo," I whispered, my voice thick with an emotion that was not grief, but a profound, startling joy. "I will give her a place of honor." The morning of the move was shrouded in a gentle fog, a soft gray curtain that lent a final intimacy to my departure. I woke before dawn and walked through the empty house one last time. The rooms, stripped of their furniture, echoed with the ghosts of laughter and arguments, of footsteps and whispered secrets. I ran my hand along the wooden banister, its surface worn smooth by the touch of my family for 2 generations. I stood in the doorway of Alan's old room and remembered the boy, not the man, and felt a pang of gratitude for the happiness he had once brought me. There was no bitterness left, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had been. On the polished surface of the fireplace mantel, I left a single, old-fashioned brass key, the original key to the house. Beside it, a simple note on thick cream paper. "Thank you for the shelter you gave. May you offer it to another family as well." Then, I walked out the front door, closed it softly behind me, and did not look back. The contrast upon arriving at my new apartment was immediate and exhilarating. The fog had burned off, and the city was bathed in brilliant sunlight. The lobby was bright and smelled of clean citrus, and the building manager greeted me with a warm smile and a small potted cyclamen as a welcome gift. The movers were efficient and respectful, their cheerful chatter a welcome sound in the empty space. As they brought in the boxes, the apartment began to transform from an empty shell into a home. The first box I opened was the small one marked Future. I unwrapped my chess set and placed it on a small table by the window, the pieces catching the light. The second thing I unpacked was Leo's drawing of the Queen. I hung it on the wall directly opposite the chess set, a guardian and a testament. The third item was my favorite teacup. I washed it in the new stainless steel sink, filled the new electric kettle, and as the water heated, I looked out the window at the vibrant, living park below. It was all mine. My new life quickly found its own rhythm, one that was slower, quieter, and entirely my own. One afternoon, while unpacking a box of Richard's books, a folded piece of paper fell out from between the pages of a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius. It was a note from him, written years ago, that I'd long forgotten. "My dearest Beatrice," it read, "never forget that your mind is the most beautiful and formidable thing I have ever known. Do not ever let anyone, not even me, convince you otherwise. It is your kingdom. Rule it well." Reading his words felt like a blessing from the past, a final validation that the path I had chosen was the right one. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I baked a loaf of bread, not for a family dinner, but for myself. The process was a meditation, the feel of the flour, the patient work of kneading the dough, the warm, yeasty smell that filled my small, bright kitchen. When it was done, I sliced off a thick, warm piece and ate it with butter and strawberry jam, standing at my window, watching the world go by. It was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. Leo visited that weekend. He didn't come with apologies or heavy conversations. He came with a bicycle pump and helped me inflate the tires on my old bike that had been in storage for a decade. We talked about his classes and my new neighbors. The ease between us was a quiet miracle. As he was leaving, he looked around my peaceful, sunlit living room. "Is this what peace feels like, Grandma?" he asked. I smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. "It's not the whole of it, my dear," I said. "But it is a very significant piece. I didn't miss the big, empty house. I didn't miss Alan's strained phone calls or Eva's brittle smiles. I didn't miss the old version of myself who used to whisper, "Maybe next time they'll see you." Because now I saw myself, and I no longer needed anyone's permission to exist. There is a point in the life of a butterfly, after the violent, messy dissolution within the chrysalis, when it must push through the final, fragile barrier into the open air. It is not an act of destruction, but of becoming. The final sale of my house felt much the same. It was not the sorrowful end of an era, but the cracking open of a shell I had long outgrown. The call came from my lawyer on a Tuesday morning. "Beatrice, the sale has officially closed." "Mr. Davidson said, "The funds have been transferred to the trust account as you instructed. It's done." I felt no surge of grief, no nostalgic pang. I had already mourned the house and the life within it. This was merely the paperwork catching up to a reality my heart had already accepted. "Thank you, David," I said, my voice serene. "Thank you for navigating the currents." That afternoon, I dressed in a simple linen dress and took a taxi to a modest downtown building, the headquarters of the Athena Project, a local charity that provided legal aid and temporary housing for women escaping abusive situations. Inside, the office was busy but calm, smelling of coffee and determination. I met with the director, a woman named Sarah, with tired but kind eyes. I didn't give a speech. I simply handed her a certified check from the trust, a sum that made her gasp softly. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. "Mrs. Wolski, I don't know what to say. This will change everything for us." I placed my hand over hers for a brief moment. "This is not charity, Sarah," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It is an investment in women who were told their minds were not their own, and who decided to prove otherwise." I had cried all the tears I had for that house. This was not a moment of grief. It was an act of profound and deliberate purpose. My new apartment, once a sterile, empty space, had become a sanctuary, not just for me, but, unexpectedly, for Leo. He began visiting weekly, his presence a quiet comfort. One rainy Saturday, he arrived with a small, sturdy cardboard box under his arm. "Grandma," he said, a little sheepishly, "is it okay if I leave this here, in your closet?" He opened it to show me. Inside were his sketchbooks, a collection of his favorite novels, and an old, battered copy of The Lord of the Rings he'd had since he was a child. "Mom, she went through my room again," he explained, his voice low. "She said my art was a distraction. She threatened to throw them out." I felt a flicker of the old anger, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of protective love. "Of course, Leo," I said, taking the box from him. "This is a safe harbor. Your treasures are safe here." We sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, a warm mug of tea in my hands and a mug of hot chocolate in his. "Do you think they'll ever change?" he asked, the question heavy with a young man's desperate hope. I thought for a long moment, not wanting to offer him a false promise. "Change is a difficult and painful process, my dear," I said, my voice gentle but honest. "A better question might be, can they ever stop pretending? Your father pretends he is a self-made man. Your mother pretends her control is a form of love. The pretense is their armor, and very few people are willing to stand unarmed." He nodded, a sad wisdom dawning in his young eyes. When he left a few hours later, the bond between us felt less like the fragile thread of family and more like the forged steel of a shared, unspoken truth. He was not just my grandson, he was my ally. A week later, a letter arrived. It was addressed in Alan's familiar, slightly sloppy handwriting. My fingers did not tremble as I opened it. The letter was 4 pages long, a rambling, disjointed mix of self-pity, confusion, and belated remorse. He wrote about his childhood, about the dacha, about how he felt lost since I had cut them out. He wrote that Ava was miserable, that their house felt empty, that he was sorry. "I don't know who I am without you telling me, Mom," the last line read. It was the most honest thing he had said in 20 years. I read the letter slowly, twice. I felt no anger, no satisfaction, no desire to respond. His confession was his own to grapple with. It was his journey, not mine. To reply would be to re-engage, to step back onto a battlefield where I no longer had any stake. I folded the letter neatly, walked over to Richard's old writing desk that I'd kept, and slid it into a back drawer. I did not throw it away. I simply archived it. It existed. His pain was real, but it no longer had the power to influence my present. It was a historical document from a country I no longer lived in. My 81st birthday began not with the jarring ring of an obligatory phone call, but with the gentle morning light filtering through my window. There were no false greetings, no forced celebrations, no expectations hanging in the air. The silence was a gift. I made myself a small stack of buttermilk pancakes, drizzling them with real maple syrup, and drank a perfect cup of coffee while reading a chapter of my book. The celebration was quiet, personal, and entirely for me. Leo arrived in the afternoon. He didn't bring a store-bought gift, but a small handmade card. On the front was a watercolor painting of a single, thriving orchid, a mirror of the one I had bought myself, which now sat in bloom on my windowsill. Inside, he had written, "Happy birthday, Grandma. Thank you for teaching me that you can build a new home inside yourself." We spent the afternoon talking, his conversation now full of his own plans, a summer internship he was applying for, a new drawing technique he was trying. He was no longer just reflecting my strength, he was building his own. As he was leaving, he paused and looked at me, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, you seem different," he said. "Happier. It's like you're a person who doesn't flinch anymore." My days settled into a peaceful, meaningful routine. I tended to my small collection of houseplants, including a resilient fern that had nearly died in the old house but was now thriving in the consistent light of my new window. Eleanor and Margaret came for dinner once a week, our evenings filled with easy laughter, good wine, and the kind of conversation that nourishes the soul. We spoke of books and politics and the absurdities of life, our friendship a warm and steady fire. On my birthday, my phone buzzed with a single text message from an unknown number, "Happy birthday." "I hope you're well." I recognized the sterile, impersonal tone. I read it, and then, without anger, without any emotion at all, I deleted it and went back to my book. That night, before I went to sleep, I opened the new journal I had bought. On the first page, which I had left blank until now, I finally wrote down the thought that had been forming in my mind for months, a final, quiet answer to the unasked questions that had started my journey. I wrote, "They once whispered that my mind was failing. They asked why, at my age, I still insisted on being so difficult. They wondered in hushed tones what I would do without them. Tonight, I finally have the answer. I am here to remember my own name. I am here to set my own table. And I am here to hold the door open, always, for those who learn to knock with clean hands.